What's up, Fort Creek youth? I am here in Athens, Georgia. Great place to be, go dogs. And I'm here with retired Reverend Franklin Scott. He was my supervisor when I was here in Athens at the Baptist Collegiate Ministries, which is about 2 miles that way, maybe 3. But the idea came up of just having some conversation, and so Franklin was gracious enough to say, hey, yeah, I'll meet with you and we'll have this conversation with you. And I got one more in store for you as well. But we're gonna, you'll notice that there's no songs this week, and that the service is just this conversation as it's about to happen. Because I thought this was important enough that I wanted you guys to focus on this. So with that, I'm gonna ask Franklin some questions about things that are going on, dealing with George Floyd, with the protests, with the riots, and just where our country is right now as it deals with those topics. So, I gave Franklin most of these questions beforehand, so he's had time to think about them and give some appropriate responses. And so, we're just going to get going.
Yep.
First off, how did things get to this point?
You and I talked maybe a week ago, and I was telling you my coach and mentor, who I've known for the last 55 years, has been in my life, and he's white. But last spring, I was visiting with him in Manning, South Carolina, and he just simply said to me at that particular time, he says, when the gap get between the haves and the have-nots as wide as it is right now, we can expect some unrest. And he has an earned PhD from the University of South Carolina. He's an educator in history. And he just simply said, these are the kind of times that any little thing can just start something like this. And so he made that comment to me last spring. He said it again this past fall. And when you ask the question, how do we get here, Chris, and I think I said this to you the other night, I think it's a failure of leadership on a national level, on a state level, on a local level, on both sides of the aisle, Republican or Democrat. I just think that if someone from Manning, South Carolina, small town Manning, South Carolina, can read the tea leaves and think that this could happen over a year ago, then someone on a national level should have known that these possibilities could happen. And so I think at all different segments of our society, we have failed on this issue in politics, in the church, in education. I just think that we stick our hands in the sand and we want to address these particular issues. And I'm not saying these issues are easy to address, but they're very, very hard.
Yeah. I had the thought recently that, and this is not a left or a right or a black or a white, but I hear a lot of people saying, hey, the government needs to fix this. The government needs to fix this. I don't think this is an issue that gets fixed by the government. I think this is a thing that the people fix.
Yeah.
That it's going to take, I look back at, and I only have history. You lived through this, but I have history to look back on of the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't the government fixing anything. It was people saying, hey, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to say it can be better. This is what it should be like.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that government can pass laws, but they can't change people's heart.
Yeah.
So I think, and that's why I said a failure of leadership in every part of our society, in church, in homes, in education. We have just let this generation down by not addressing some issues that we probably should have addressed.
So with that in mind, what is it about George Floyd's murder that's the tipping point? What is it that's kind of made this the place where people are going, okay, enough's enough?
Well, I think all of it, in a nutshell, is you got people losing their jobs, you got people not able to pay their mortgage, not able to pay their their rent.
From the coronavirus.
Yeah, from the coronavirus, to that people are just on edge right now. And so I think with all of those kinds of different things, nobody's going to blame themselves for whatever circumstances they find themselves in. They're always going to blame somebody else for the circumstances that they find themselves in. And so right now, I think that because people are unemployed, because people are finding a hard way to feed their families, and all these different things, something like the Floyd situation just ignited that whole situation. Mm-hmm. But, we had what? We've had 3 or 4 of these things in the last few months. The situation here in Georgia.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's just been building and building and building. And so I think the Floyd thing, surrounded by all those other circumstances, which my coach was talking about, economically, culturally, socially, and 110,000 people dying. I think the Floyd thing was just people saying, hey, look, good God, give us some leadership.
Yeah.
Help. And so I think that's the tipping point of it.
Okay. I'm going to try and do these as best I can in some kind of logical order.
Yeah.
So with everything that's been going on, what do you think actually is the root issue that is at work here?
I think the root issue is sin. We all are born into a fallen society, and you don't have to teach. You guys got small kids, so you can remember this. You don't have to teach them to say "my toy."
Yep. Yep.
This is mine. This is mine. So I think the root of evil of it is it's always gone back to just sin. The first murder in Scripture was Cain killing his brother Abel. And so I think that the root of all of this is that we're selfish and we're fallen people, and we're stained with the lostness of darkness of sin.
Okay. Specific passages of Scripture. Are there any specific passages of Scripture that you can think of that really address, I think it would be hard to find something that addresses the coronavirus. Yeah. Maybe some things in Revelation, but at that point you may start doing some scare tactics more than anything. Yeah. But especially on the racism thing, is there something in Scripture that speaks specifically to?
Yeah, I think so. I think the passage I was just talking about, I know it's brother against brother, but he asks a fundamental question that God doesn't answer, and I think God doesn't answer because it's an insane question. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, God didn't answer because it was a very stupid question. Yes, you're your brother's keeper.
Yeah.
And so I think that from the basic standpoint from humanity, all the cries right now is that who cares if the officer was white and Floyd was black? Just the basic humanity. How can you stand kneel on someone's knee for 8 or 9 minutes and not feel anything, that this is a human being, this is a child of God, and you respond? And so I think that Scripture, I think the Scripture in Genesis, when God called Abraham and made the promises to Abraham, he said, sure, I'm going to give you a famous name. I'm going to give you a land to call you on. I'm going to bless those who bless you. I'm going to curse those who curse you. I'm going to protect you. And I'm going to make you a blessing. I'm going to bless you to become a blessing. But then, Chris, the 5th promise he makes is what? All the families, all the nations of this world will be blessed because of you.
Yep.
So the Scripture is just full of it. When he first initiated a covenant with Abraham, he was saying, yes, I've chosen to use the vessel of the Jews, but all people will be blessed because of you. Now you fast forward to the New Testament, because they misunderstood that statement, Paul says in Ephesians 2, he said a mystery that even the founding fathers didn't recognize and understood is something I want to provide it to you. That even the founding fathers didn't understand that there weren't just Jews and Gentiles, but God has come and sent his Son to break down that dividing wall and to destroy that dividing wall to make one new people who are just going to be Christians. And so that scripture is just talking about, hey, look, it's not about Jews or Gentiles. It's about people who have been created by God.
Yep.
And so I think the scriptures are very, very clear. And sometimes he's not specific because it's, I guess because the Jewish people got it wrong.
Yeah.
They took that their special treasure meant that I am special and nobody else is special. And so I think it's been throughout Scripture. The Philemon passage where Paul writes to, write to the slave owner of Philemon and say he went away and ran from you as a slave, but now he comes back to you as a brother. Treat him as a brother and not as a slave. And so, and Paul constantly saying, have no perspective of male or female, Jew or Gentile, wise or unwise. So I think the scripture is all over that he's speaking that there's only one group of people, and that's believers.
Well, and I think that brings up the interesting point. A lot of people want to talk about equality. Well, I think it depends upon how you view the world. Because if you're viewing the world how God sees it, we're all equal to him.
Yep.
Because our sin is no different than, my sin is no worse than your sin, and your sin is no worse than my sin.
Yeah.
It's just sin to God.
Yep.
And so in that regard,
yeah,
that's not something you hear on the national level.
Yeah. But there were standards from God's people that God called his people to live by. And so many times, and I know you know this because you've read Isaiah, the first thing God said was what? Your worship is despicable to me. Your sacrifice is like stench to my nostrils. And then he goes on to list some things. Because you have not cared for what? The vulnerable people, the elderly people, the children. And you have not, that justice does not reign in your courts. But injustice is there. And those are three of the major reasons why the nation of Israel fell to Babylonians. It's because they failed to act justly and treat the marginal people well. And so, yes, you're right. Yes, equality, God expressed equality to all of us. But I think people in power has a responsibility to act justly.
I think we're actually in a place in history where people that are in power will actually pay attention to this. I would hope.
Well,
if you look back at history throughout periods of time when it was more kings were ruling.
Oh yeah.
Nobody would ever pay attention to this. So I think we're at a place in time when this can be addressed.
Yeah. I think anybody you talk to, if you talk to seven out of 10 black people that you would talk to, or brown people, or any minority in this country, 7 out of 10 people you talk to, and you ask them, is the world better than it was 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, or 50 years ago? And each and every one of them would say yes. And I wouldn't want to live anyplace else than America. But that doesn't mean that it's right.
Yeah.
What's happening is right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that there's not still room for progression and room for progress.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you're right. There are probably people that will listen today, but just, what are going to be your actions?
Yeah.
I think Andy Stanley said the other day, he said that, it's time not to see things like the Floyd situation and say, oh my God, I feel so horrible for that. And that's it. And you don't take any actions to do anything or try to make a difference in that. And
so, that kind of brings up some things that I want to get across to the youth. For our youth, and this is me filling you in on McDuffie County.
Yeah.
I don't think it's purposefully. I don't think people set out for there to be segregation within the county. I think it just one of those things that naturally happened. That this group of people is going to live over here. This group of people. I think it's just kind of one of those things that just as things panned out, that's just what happened. But and this is, I'm going to ask the question as if I'm one of the youth. What can I, as a teenager in Deering, in Thompson, or in Harlem, what can I actually do that will make a difference?
I think that's a phenomenal question that your student asks. What can I do? And I think I may have mentioned this to you the other night too. I think that the first thing that all of us can do is to lean into a situation. Don't put our heads in the sand and say, well, just because it doesn't affect my immediate circle of friends, then I don't need to address that issue.
Yeah.
I think you got to lean into it. I think that I love the fact that the scripture says that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. And we knew what was going to happen in Jerusalem, meaning that Jesus was not backing down for his responsibility to go to the cross. And so he faced it head on and recognized that this is something that I need to address. Well, I think that if I'm living in a community that maybe I don't come in contact with a whole lot of brown or black people, then I would try to become aware, make a strange friend. I think I told you that. Becky Matini it was about outreach, and she was telling our students, she said, this year you need to try to make a strange friend. You need to get outside the walls of BSU and make a strange friend. Something that you told us too when you were there working. And so I think that what I would try to do, it may not be a large percentage of brown people in your community, but there's somebody in your community that's different.
Yeah.
That you can get to know.
Well, especially for our kids that are going to Harlem High School and to Thompson High School, I know they have peers that are black, and I know that they have relationships with them. So I know that there are going to be some practical things that these students can do.
Yeah, become friends. Engage them in conversation. Ask about these kinds of things. I think lean into it. I think engage people about this. Hey, look, I don't know. I love what Kirby said to a parent. And he said this 3 years ago. Kirby said, I don't have a clue what it means to be black in America. He says, but what I promise you is I will always have people around me that understand and know what it means to be black. And they will be informing me how to best serve your child. And so I think that engaging and asking questions, and sometimes you're not going to like the answer, and it doesn't mean that you have to get up and agree with everything somebody said, but you still should engage and talk. I think the problem is we can't have honest conversation about things. Personally, I don't think that Drew Brees should have apologized for what he said. I think that what Drew Brees probably should have said, and I think he was ambushed when I heard the recording. I think he was just ambushed by this. They know how he felt, so they asked that question at that particular time, and he responded to that question. Let me tell you, I went through the 60s. My dad was a military guy. My dad recognized the fact that people could protest, and he agreed with people protesting. But when they started burning flags, my dad did not like that. My dad did not like that, and they lost him, and he was angry as all get up. And I can still remember, son, if you ever do something like that, I would kill you. And he meant that. So I think that what Drew Brees should have said was this. I recognize that from my teammates that racism still consists in America, and that my friends get stopped, my friends get harassed, my friends, things are happening in the world that is bad for black and brown people. But, and I recognize them, I understand that, and I understand that there kneeling is not disrespecting the flag or meant to disrespect military. But I just don't think I could do that because of my grandfather. I just don't think, hey, I'm black, and there's no way in the world I would kneel because I know what my dad would feel about something like that. And so I would never do that. So he didn't have, so my point is honest conversations.
Yeah.
Honest conversations of saying, hey, I hear what you're saying. I hear that these things happen to you guys. I just do not agree with the way you're trying to go about doing this from that particular standpoint. So if you're going to engage people, I think that really and truly what you will come up with is some really and truly middle ground. And not necessarily that you're going to change your whole opinion about how you see the world, but you'll begin to understand somebody else, the way somebody else feels about the world.
Yeah.
I don't expect you to change your whole mindset of how you see the world. I just want you to understand how I see the world.
Yeah.
And see that as a valid response.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true for you. I may disagree with what you may think, but that doesn't stop me from loving you and accepting you and being your friend. So that's what I mean about engaging. And then something that Andy said I think is so very, very important is a measured response. A measured response, a strategy. I hope now that you guys sit down with these videos and start thinking about how do we respond as a church? How do we help you guys be exposed to the greater world that's out there? Because sooner or later they're going to leave Deer Park.
Yep.
They're going to go to college someplace where they're going to come in contact with other different kinds of people.
Yep.
They're going to go out into the workforce and they're going to become involved with people who are different kind of people.
Yeah.
So if you don't help them now, and that's what I meant about leadership with church leadership, what are we doing to help prepare people for those kinds of things?
Yeah.
And so that'll be it.
So, you mentioned your dad not liking kneeling and burning flags. That kind of leads to a question that somebody asked: is the protesting and rioting justified? Now, to me, those are two separate separate things.
Two separate things.
Protesting is one thing, but rioting, it kind of it's an entirely different thing in its own. So I'm going to let you answer the question, though.
I think that protesting is something very legitimate, and my dad felt that yes, in the '60s, he supported the people going out in the streets and letting their displeasure be known. And so I see nothing wrong with them protesting even now, burning down things and the violence. I think that's not acceptable. That's really not acceptable, but it's understandable. I think what happens, and please hear what I'm saying. I'm all for peaceful protesting. I'm all for that, but it's a mixed bag. I went to the 30th, and I might have this wrong. I was a part of the paint crew at Southern Seminary. And so on the 30th or the 20th anniversary of Dr. King's March to Washington, me and a bunch of my friends who were white, we went to the March on Washington to celebrate it. David Rowland was in that crew, David and 2 or 3 other guys. We drove all night long, we went there, and we marched. One of the things I came to understand, there's a whole lot of strange people there, that it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
When you start to do things like that, there were some people that, we were looking around and saying, oh my God, I definitely would not want to be in a dark alley with these folks. But I think that what happens, even in a legal protest, it's going to draw elements. It's going to draw elements that are not as savory elements. I took Black history classes in college, and I was a firm believer in Martin Luther King's movement of nonviolence. But as I studied Stokely Carmichael's, H. Rap Brown, people that were much more militant, I understood where they were coming from. Their response was this: nothing has ever happened in America And I remember reading this, that one of those guys said this: we have never seen real change in America without violence. That was their opinion now. Not that I say that that's a legitimate opinion, but they said the American Revolution, the Civil War, all the world wars, nothing legitimately happened until people started to take matters in their own hands. Now, whether that's a legitimate claim or not, now you know me well. I've never, other than that march on Washington, I've never been a part of a protest. I'll never be a part of anything rioting or anything violent. It's just not my nature. But it doesn't stop me from hearing that. I may not totally agree with that, but I understand that mindset. That people are frustrated. People are saying that, hey, look, why is there no real lasting change? And all the talking sometimes doesn't seem to get that done. And so people like Stokely Carmichael's, people like H. Rap Brown made the choices that they made. Were they legitimate choices? To me, it wouldn't be legitimate choices, but I understand why people are angry. And I understand why people are doing what they're doing now. Some of those people. Not that I agree with it.
So, I go on, I try not to zero in on, on the news or anything like that. But when I do, I try to not just look from one perspective. I try to get, if you're only looking from one perspective, that's all you ever see. And so you don't ever, like a lot of what you said, you never begin to understand what the other side of the coin would think about a situation. And, of course, each side is going to pan to their side.
Yep.
And so, there's kind of two little, I guess, storylines. I guess that's the best way of saying it that I've heard. And one of them was, I saw a documentary where somebody was trying to go in and was trying to talk with rioters, not protesters, but with rioters. And they were saying, why are you doing this? And a lot of it was, I just saw anger. A lot of it was anger. I have a feeling that a lot of it was some wrong education along the way. A lot of these were young black men, and they were saying, well, all white people have done this to me, and I see those kind of things panning out. And one of our students, I've heard some of our students ask me this question, am I, as a white person, am I to blame in any of this? Because the media is trying to at least put that out there, that with white privilege and with all these things, that teenagers, are we to blame for what is happening right now?
That's such a complex question, and an answer would be very, very complex too. I think that, it's the same old statement that some Southerners would have. Well, I never owned any slaves. I never owned one slave. So I'm not the problem because I didn't own a slave. That's half true. That's not whole true. That's half true. If you put up with a culture and put up with a mindset, then yes, you are part of the problem. Whether you take part in it or whether you don't take part in it. Was every Israelite the blame for injustice that was happening in Jerusalem at the time? Was every?
Probably not.
No. But they weren't separated, were they?
Yeah.
He said, this is what I feel the nation has allowed to happen. And so I think that you don't necessarily have to say, well, I own slaves, or I hate people, or I go out and practice, racial injustice or anything like that. But I think that, but if you fail to speak up about it, then all of us have some blame. Even black people hold blame. We had a nice conversation last Sunday with my kids, and where we live. I chose to live over there. I didn't go and live in a black community. I chose to live there. Well, am I a little blame? Yes, I'm a little bit of blame. Even as a black person, I shoulder some responsibility for not at least getting into these communities and you've heard it from me constantly. Some of my black guilt that that maybe we should have moved into an African American neighborhood and try to do some good there where I was and not go segregate my kids out where I did. And so I made choices, and yes, I made choices for my kids and for their well-being. I shared with Joe the other day, and we had that same conversation too. You know, my girls was not out of our sight. We didn't back our kids up and send them back to their grandparents. We just didn't do it, neither side, because we didn't like everything that was happening in that culture and in that community. Our kids didn't go to the sleepovers a whole lot. Now, we hosted sleepovers, so our kids didn't go to a whole lot of sleepovers. We were very, very protective of them. And so to a certain extent, yes, I'm a blame for some of this. So I don't want to try to throw any guilt trip on anybody at all. And you know me, and I'm not saying anything maliciously to anyone, but
It is more of a personal responsibility
it's
thing.
a personal responsibility.
And this may go back to what, as a teenager, what can they do? If you see something going on,
Speak up.
speak up.
Yeah.
Stop somebody from doing something you know they shouldn't be doing. I know that seems like you're a goody two-shoe in it, but think about the larger picture at that point, because if you let this pass and you don't say anything, yeah, they're right.
Yeah.
You do carry some blame. So
Yeah. If you laugh at a racist joke and don't confront it, I mean, there's all kinds of little things that happens. But do I think a 16-year-old need to walk around with any guilt? No, they don't need to. They don't need to.
they're kind of learning about this
They're
right
learning
now.
and they're in process. And again, what was my first statement? Failure of leadership. Helping people to do what?
Right
To
thing.
address these issues. If a kid came to you and they were having an alcohol problem, you would certainly set them down and say, "Hey, look, this is not good for you. You need to take a look at this and get this under control." If a boyfriend was talking to her about having sex, you'll say, "Hey, look, this is not going to help you long term. That's not going to help you, and you need to address this issue in your life and not do this." Well, if you hear something come out of their mouth that you know is not good and healthy for them, that's not going to serve you well in the future.
Yeah.
And talk with them and try to help them to get to understand people. But I wouldn't go as far as and say that their fault. But I do think silence about things that you see, things that you feel, you do have all of us have some blame. That's whether you're black or whether you're white. If that makes sense now.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I've seen and I've heard some students talk about is they feel like, why is religion and specifically Christianity, why is it being pushed aside as an excuse for allowing racism to occur? It's almost like they're saying, "Hey, you're a Christian. What you're going to say is not valid." You've almost been, because you're a Christian, you're part of the reason that this is here.
I think I'll go back again and say, I've lived and worked for Southern Baptist for over 35 years. I raised my kids, put braces on my kids' teeth, and I consider myself a Southern Baptist still. But we haven't always responded well to some of these issues.
Yeah.
We just haven't.
That's why the whole Southern Baptist Convention exists.
Yeah. Well, see, I think that's a part of their history that these kids need to understand and know. Southern Baptist Convention existed because of the slave issue.
Yep.
Of the slave issue. And we've been very slow to react and respond to some things that are very pertinent in our community. And so I think that, well, I'll say it this way. the early church was way ahead of society. In Paul's day, the early church was way ahead of society on freedom, on women's freedom, on justice. They were way ahead of society. You know, we have an MLK service on campus, not because the university made that decision. We have a MLK service on campus because the Campus Ministers Association at that time in the 60s fought for that and worked for that. And the university is taking it over now because it's popular.
Yeah.
But initially, that was the Campus Ministers Association that did that. And so the early church was way ahead of society. I think what's happened to us in some ways, Chris, and just be honest, I think we have slid back. and sometimes now the government on some of these issues, that's the reason why you asked the question, the reason why the government has taken a forefront on that, and the federal government is one of those things. It's the 60s. It was the federal government that was fighting for civil rights. It's the federal government that was doing these particular things. Now, yes, the church had a voice in it too, but it was mostly the government making those decisions and forcing these things to happen with Brown versus Education and all that stuff, the Board of Education. You know, we gave that stuff over to the government. And so to some people, we've lost that prophetic voice. We've lost that prophetic voice.
I agree with that.
And so, and I don't mean that as some horrible negative thing, because I love our pastors, I love our churches, and I love who they are. And I know that they're standing in the gap between what people want or what people are comfortable with and what you feel God's calling you to do. And so those are tough decisions you have to make. And I know at your past church, you had to make some tough decisions. This is what's right. Some leadership may not think this is right, but this is what I know to be right.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to die on this hill. And you did. I mean, well, you didn't die, but you made some tough decisions to do some tough things.
Yeah.
And so I think that, but it gave you equity among those families to say, Chris is going to fight for us, and Chris is going to do what's right. And so I think that the church has a responsibility. And so if the church has been set aside, I think it's a good question and a good question to ask. The church is set aside, yes, it's set aside, but not only because people are responding in that way, because they've lost their prophetic voice. So,
Because they've kind of lost the right to be heard.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah. I think it's, I can't remember the guy, the Italian Christian comedian. He said he met a young lady that was down on her luck, and he told her, he said, hey, look, I want to take you to this church down here, and these people will help you. She said, Anthony Canapola, he said, man, I feel horrible enough about myself now. I want to go to church and feel worse about who I am, because all it was focusing on was her sins and not on what she could become and what can be. And Canapola did a phenomenal message on that. So, I love the church. I think it's the last great institution for change in our world. But we have to be about our Father's business. And Luke 4 says what? I mean, you ask about Scripture. Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. For He's called me to what? To heal the brokenhearted, to release the captives, to set these folks free. And so that was a very prophetic voice. What happened? You remember what happened shortly after he made that message in his hometown? What they wanted to do?
They kicked him out.
They wanted to stone him.
Yep.
They wanted to kill him. And so I think that prophetic voice is what's missing sometimes. We apologize for addressing something that's wrong. Because we're afraid that we're going to offend someone or hurt someone's feelings. And that's not a prophetic voice.
Last time I checked, the gospel is supposed to hurt some feelings.
The gospel is offensive. It's very much offensive.
So,
yeah.
one of these I don't think I need to ask, but this one's maybe a little more pointed. I'm going to try and ask this the best way I know how. Antifa and Black Lives Matter are two of the loudest voices that are out there that the media is giving coverage to. Why are they so... Antifa specifically is violent. I don't think Black Lives Matter is. Why is Antifa so violent? And it's almost like both of them have a mentality that if you're not for me, you're just automatically against me. Why is that there?
Yeah, you know, and again, I don't know enough about... The first time I ever heard the word Antifa is I heard it in the news. That's the first I've known of them. So I don't know enough about them to know whether they are, to make an opinion about whether they're violent or whether they're not violent. I just don't know. I had a couple pastors ask me a couple of years ago about Black Lives Matter. Didn't have a clue about Black Lives Matter. I haven't read anything about them. I have heard since that time, because I had a pastor that was talking to me. He had an African American in his church, and he had a dispute with this guy because he had read some stuff online about who Black Lives Matter was, and he asked me about something, and I couldn't answer it intelligently. I said, I really don't know. And an African American guy actually left his church, and had been a long time deacon in their church and been a part of their church, and I could tell it was hurting him that this happened. And I told him, I don't know. I really don't have a clue about Black Lives Matter. Now, a few years later now, I read that there were social media stuff that were pretending to be Black Lives Matter and putting all kinds of outrageous stuff, posting it, and just to bring division and strife between people. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But some of the things that he was saying, some of the things he was asking me about, again, I don't know enough about either one of those groups to know whether they are or whether they're not. I really don't.
Okay.
Time.
Yeah, we've been going for a while. So make sure kids are doing the research on those groups.
Yeah, that's what I would do.
And this is where knowing Christian values would come in. You know, where do those groups stand on, you know, the value of human life? If they're violent, we probably know where they stand on that.
Yep.
You know, to me, human life also would come down to the issues maybe of abortion. You know, where do they stand on that issue?
Yeah, but is that a group? I hear exactly what you're saying. About 5 or 6 years ago, a group claiming to be pro-life was bombing abortion clinics and doing a lot of horrible things.
And that's not the way to go.
That's several abortion doctors were assassinated and all those things. Now, the validity of pro-life, with some people doing those kinds of things, claiming to be pro-life folks, does that take away the validity of the issue? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that a good synopsis of that?
Yeah.
I don't know about Antifa. I don't know about Black Lives Matter. I don't know about either one of those groups. But I know that I read about, you know, bombings in abortion clinics from people that call themselves pro-life. Well, that's counter to anything. You know, it's just counter. You know, how can I say I have a sanctity for life? You know, one last thing, Chris. How do I can say I have a sanctity for life and I don't want to see abortion happen, but I can sit and watch a kid shot down in the middle of the street and have no empathy for that, or watch someone kneel on a person's neck and have no empathy for that? Those are contradicting to each other. To say I have a sanctity for life, but I can watch these two things happen and I would rationalize and justify those things. I just have a hard time with that.
'Cause to me, they're the same thing.
you know,
Murder's murder.
yeah, it's difficult for me to separate that. Now, some people will come back at you and say, well, this is innocent life. This is innocent life
Yeah.
too. And does a person,
Whether George Floyd had a counterfeit $20 bill on him or not doesn't matter.
it's not a life sentence. It's not a death sentence.
No.
Whether this kid had invaded somebody's property, whether he stole something or whatever,
This still doesn't equal a death penalty.
that's not a death penalty.
No.
And so I think that's the kind of thing of trying to watch something with clear eyes and not trying to rationalize, well, this wouldn't have happened if he wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The converse thing could be said is if he was white, it wouldn't happen.
Well, Chris, I didn't see this on the news, but I heard it 3 or 4 weeks ago. A white gentleman with a machete, waving a machete, had 4 police officers, and he didn't die.
He just got tased or something.
He didn't die.
Yeah.
The Michigan people came to the courthouse, inside the courthouse, with guns. They said it was empty. Nobody died. Nobody got beaten up.
Yeah.
And so you can debate whether you think that there is racism in our world or not. You can debate with that. But when is the last time you read anything in the paper about a white person being stopped?
Because they were white.
Being killed because of a traffic violation.
Yeah.
I mean, there may be out there. Now, I don't know. There may be out there, but I haven't heard that.
Now, you've experienced something like that personally, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, several times. Several times I've been pulled over and stopped. And just a couple years ago, I was pulled over about, probably about 8 miles outside of Athens. And I wasn't speeding. I knew I wasn't speeding. And so they stopped me. He asked me, he said, hey, look, I said, why did you stop me? He said, you were speeding. I said, sir, I'm sitting there watching the dashboard. I've had a few violations, and so I know I'm not speeding. My wife was sitting over there, and she was asleep. And
It's a good thing she stayed asleep then.
And then he said to me, he said, well, if you don't believe me, come back and take a look at the radar. And I mean, it's pitch dark outside. And I said, no. He said, well, you don't want to go and see? I said, no, you can do whatever you need to do, but I'm not getting out of this car and going back and taking a look at your radar. And I'm not. And because I've had too many experiences. Now, does that say every cop's bad? No, I'm not saying every cop's bad. I'm just not. But I'm not getting out of a car at 10 or 11 o'clock at night and going back and having a dispute with someone about whether I was speeding or not. My mama didn't raise no fool. And so I stayed in the car. He gave me a ticket and I went on and I paid it. And that was it. But I think, Chris, the last thing I would say is I think all of us, I don't know if you listened to Andy's message this past week, but it's just a really, really wonderful message. And Andy said this. He said, can you believe in the 10 Commandments? Can you live the 10 Commandments and still be a racist? And he says, yes, you can. He said, we got evidence of Paul. Paul kept the 10 Commandments. Paul said he was flawless. But Paul still hated Gentiles and hated this sect called Christians. I mean, so he said that, yes, that transformation, we're all in process. And so we all have issues. And so I think that, and I think you've heard me talk about my Uncle Cleveland. Man, my Uncle Cleveland was a great guy to us. He always had candy in his pocket, always had money to give us. My Uncle Cleveland was a racist. He was a black racist. And my grandmama and my mama told me, and said, hey, you can't listen to anything this guy says, man. You just got to watch what he says. You can't, And so it's not hard for me to understand that I have biases inside of me. But, God said it to Cain. Jesus said it to Peter. He says, Sin is crouching at your door, and it seeks to have you, but you got to master it. Jesus said the same thing to Paul. Sin is seeking to sift you, and you got to master it. So, I mean, where we started at, and you're talking about the root of all of this, is sin. And so we have to understand and know that we have biases inside of us. I'm a basketball guy. I'm a Jordan guy. LeBron, who? I'm a Jordan guy, and I'm probably going to die a Jordan guy.
I'm right there with you on that.
And so I think that there are biases. You know that my team that I like is North Carolina basketball. Now, I'll tell you that I like North Carolina basketball because they play basketball the right way. But if I'm honest with you, because I grew up in South Carolina, I like Dean Smith because I met Dean Smith once in Columbia. I like North Carolina because they had the first black player in the ACC, and he was black, and his name was Charlie Scott. So he looked like me, and he had my name. So that love for them started because of my bias, because he's a black guy. So why would I lie and say that wasn't one of the reasons why I started liking Carolina? They had somebody out there playing that looked like me. And so, I liked them. And I'd met Dean Smith. I'd experienced Dean Smith. So I would be lying if I said, why didn't you like South Carolina? Well, there was too much baggage in South Carolina. And so, I don't know if this helps.
That and Jordan went to North Carolina too.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say to the kids is, I don't speak for all black people, just like you don't speak for all white people. Just my humble opinion of 67 years of living. But guys, you got a wonderful, wonderful minister. He loves you. He loves the Lord, and he's going to do the right thing by you. I know this for a fact. He's a good man. He's a very good man.
Well, thank you, Franklin. Thank you very much. Guys, I hope you'll take what has been said and process. There's at least 50 minutes worth of stuff to process. It's probably going to be... You're going to have to watch this more than once, probably. But I would even suggest, have conversations with your parents, with your grandparents. Talk about this. This is not something that is a one-and-done conversation. This is going to be a continuing thing. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll see you guys soon.
Well, it's not...
Say that again. I'm recording this one.
Well, I've been to Germany, and I've also been to Russia. And in both places, after the communist rule went down, they took down the monuments, they took down the statues, and all those things. But has it changed in those areas? No, because all it did was Communist Party went underground, and the Communist Party is still very much alive and well now. But I think that you leave these monuments up, you leave the Confederate flag up, or whatever else people want to leave up, because it's a reminder. And if you don't embrace your history, you're going to repeat your history. And so I think that I don't think there's any validity in trying to take down monuments. There's absolutely stupidity trying to defund or dismantle police departments. That is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my life. And so I think that, again, not honest looks at things.
Seattle's got a whole 5-block space now where there's no police. People have taken over 5 blocks worth of downtown Seattle, and
it's ridiculous and it's silly to even think that those kind of things can happen. But you just got, and again, it goes back to what I was saying, leadership. When you got poor leadership, you got poor leadership. And when you got people in these groups that don't have the sense God gave them, you can actually make those kind of requests. So I just think.